You watch as colleagues smile to your face while undermining your projects behind closed doors, leaving you wondering who you can actually trust in your workplace. Every betrayal cuts deeper because you believed their words, their promises, their false displays of loyalty, while they systematically dismantled your reputation and opportunities. I am Niccolò Machiavelli, the political strategist who spent decades observing the treacherous courts of Renaissance Italy, where trust was a luxury that could cost you everything. What I discovered about the 4 unmistakable signs of betrayal will transform how you identify dangerous people before they can destroy your career, relationships, or peace of mind. The same principles that helped me navigate the deadliest political intrigues of my era can protect you from the manipulators and backstabbers in today's world. But first, like this video, subscribe for more timeless wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready to master the art of reading people's true intentions. I was barely 25 when I entered the marble halls of Florence's government, my mind filled with idealistic notions about public service and the nobility of political work. The council chamber, with its soaring ceilings and ornate frescoes depicting virtuous leaders of antiquity, seemed like a temple to justice and wisdom. How naive I was to believe that such grandeur could inspire virtue in the men who gathered beneath it. My first mentor, Francesco Valori, was everything I aspired to become: eloquent, respected, seemingly devoted to the Republic's welfare. He took me under his wing, teaching me the intricacies of diplomatic correspondence and the art of political negotiation. For months, I hung on his every word, believing I had found in him the embodiment of the principled statesman. But power, I would learn, reveals character like fire reveals the purity of gold. When the opportunity arose for Valori to secure a lucrative position overseeing grain imports, he did not hesitate to fabricate evidence against his closest rival, a man who had trusted him completely. I watched in horror as he presented forged documents to the council, his voice steady and convincing as he destroyed an innocent man's reputation. What shattered me was not just the betrayal itself, but how naturally it came to him. There was no tremor in his voice, no hesitation in his manner. He had rehearsed this deception so thoroughly that it flowed from his lips like prayer from a priest. That night, as I walked the dark streets of Florence, I realized that my education in human nature had only just begun. The painted saints on the council chamber walls watched over men who would betray their own mothers for the right price. The marble columns supported not just the building's roof, but the weight of countless lies and betrayals. I began to observe more carefully, to listen not just to what people said, but to what they didn't say. I watched how they positioned themselves in rooms, how they spoke about absent colleagues, how they responded when their own mistakes were exposed. Patterns emerged, predictable, reliable patterns that would serve me well in the treacherous decades to come. The Republic itself taught me that survival required understanding that most people wear masks, and those masks are designed to hide intentions that would horrify you if revealed. This was not cynicism, but pragmatism. This was not cruelty, but wisdom born from necessity. The council chamber had become my first classroom in the University of Human Deception, and Francesco Valori my first professor in the art of betrayal. The morning of April 26, 1478, dawned like any other in Florence, but by evening, the cobblestones of the cathedral would be stained with blood, and my understanding of human treachery would deepen beyond anything I thought possible. I was there, in the Duomo, when the Pazzi family and their allies attempted to assassinate Lorenzo de' Medici during High Mass. What struck me most was not the violence itself, but how thoroughly the conspirators had infiltrated Lorenzo's inner circle. Francesco Salviati, the Archbishop of Pisa, had dined at Lorenzo's table just days before. The Pazzi bankers had handled the Medici finances for years, sharing intimate knowledge of their wealth and vulnerabilities. These were not distant enemies. These were trusted allies, who had been planning murder while breaking bread with their intended victims. I watched Lorenzo escape through the sacristy, blood streaming from the wounds inflicted by men who had sworn loyalty to his family. His brother Giuliano was not so fortunate. 19 stab wounds from daggers, wielded by hands that had clasped his in friendship mere hours before. The conspirators had counted on surprise, on the sacred setting making their targets vulnerable, on years of cultivated trust creating the perfect opportunity for betrayal. But what fascinated me most was how the warning signs had been there all along, ignored by the very people whose lives depended on recognizing them. Francesco Pazzi had become increasingly critical of Medici policies in recent months, yet Lorenzo attributed this to honest disagreement rather than malicious intent. Salviati had been asking unusual questions about security arrangements, which the Medici dismissed as natural concern for their safety. The conspirators had isolated Lorenzo from his most loyal guards by suggesting they would be insulting to bring into God's house. They had tested boundaries by requesting private meetings and access to sensitive information. They had shared secrets about other noble families, creating false intimacy while gathering intelligence. And when their previous schemes had failed, they had blamed external circumstances rather than taking responsibility for their incompetence. Standing in that blood-soaked cathedral, I realized I had witnessed all 4 signs of impending betrayal playing out over months. Yet even the brilliant Lorenzo de' Medici had failed to recognize the pattern. The Pazzi conspiracy became my masterclass in understanding that the most dangerous enemies are always those who appear closest to you, who have earned your trust precisely so they can destroy you when you least expect it. The failed assassination taught me that survival requires constant vigilance, not paranoia, but careful observation of the patterns that reveal true character. The Medici had wealth, power, and intelligence, yet they nearly perished because they trusted their enemies' masks rather than watching their actions. Years later, my diplomatic missions brought me into the presence of perhaps the most dangerous man I ever encountered, Cesare Borgia, the Duke of Valentino. If Francesco Valori had been my introduction to betrayal and the Pazzi conspiracy, my education in recognizing patterns, then Cesare Borgia's court was my doctorate in the sophisticated art of manipulation. Cesare possessed a magnetism that drew people to him like iron filings to a lodestone. He was handsome, articulate, generous with his praise, and seemingly genuinely interested in everyone he met. Watching him work a room was like watching a master artist paint, every gesture calculated, every word chosen for maximum effect, every smile deployed with surgical precision. I spent months observing him during our negotiations, and what I witnessed was a systematic methodology for identifying, cultivating, and ultimately destroying potential threats. Cesare never attacked his enemies directly. Instead, he made them complicit in their own destruction through a carefully orchestrated process that I came to recognize as the 4 signs of betrayal in action. First, he would isolate his targets from their support networks. When dealing with the condottieri, the mercenary captains who might challenge his authority, he would invite them to private meetings, shower them with honors that separated them from their troops, and gradually create situations where they became dependent on his favor rather than their own resources. He made them feel special, chosen, elevated above their peers until they found themselves cut off from the very people who had once been their strength. Then came the boundary testing. Cesare would make small requests that violated normal protocol, asking them to dismiss loyal lieutenants, to share strategic information they should have kept confidential, to take actions that compromised their honor in minor ways. Each compliance made the next violation easier to accept. He was conditioning them like a trainer working with animals, teaching them to accept his authority in progressively larger matters. The third element was his masterful use of information warfare. Cesare would share secrets about other condottieri, their financial troubles, their family scandals, their military weaknesses. This created a false sense of intimacy and special status, while simultaneously demonstrating his extensive intelligence network. The victims felt privileged to receive such confidential information, not realizing they were being shown exactly what would happen to their own secrets when it suited his purposes. Finally, when his schemes occasionally failed or his victims showed unexpected resistance, Cesare never took responsibility. It was always bad advice from subordinates, unfortunate timing, or the unreasonable stubbornness of his targets. This pattern of blame shifting should have warned his victims that a man who could not accept responsibility for small failures would certainly not hesitate to sacrifice them when larger stakes were involved. The brilliance of Caesar's approach was its subtlety. His victims never realized they were being manipulated until it was too late. By the time they recognized the pattern, they were already isolated, compromised, and vulnerable. The massacre at Senigallia, where he eliminated multiple threats in a single evening, was the culmination of months of this systematic psychological warfare. The first and most crucial warning sign of impending betrayal is when someone systematically works to separate you from your support network. I learnt this principle through painful observation in the Venetian court, where I watched Ambassador Marco Dandolo destroy his rival through what appeared to be acts of kindness and special attention. Dandolo's target was Lorenzo Grimani, a respected diplomat whose influence threatened the ambassador's own ambitions. Rather than attacking Grimani directly, Dandolo began a campaign of isolation disguised as elevation. He started inviting Grimani to exclusive private dinners, claiming that his insights were too valuable to share with others. He suggested that Grimani's talents were being wasted in group settings where lesser minds couldn't appreciate his brilliance. Within months, Grimani found himself attending fewer council meetings and more private consultations. Dandolo convinced him that this special access represented his rising status, when in reality it was cutting him off from his traditional allies and sources of information. By the time Grimani realized what was happening, his former supporters had grown accustomed to making decisions without him, and his influence had evaporated. This isolation tactic works because it exploits our natural desire to feel special and important. When someone suggests that we're too good for our current circle, that we deserve better treatment, that others don't appreciate our true worth, they're appealing to our ego while simultaneously weakening our defenses. They position themselves as the only person who truly understands us, creating a dangerous dependency. In modern workplaces, I see this pattern constantly repeated. A manipulative colleague will begin scheduling private meetings with their target, suggesting that sensitive matters require discretion. They'll hint that other team members are gossiping or plotting, encouraging their victim to distance themselves from potential allies. They'll offer special projects or responsibilities that require working in isolation, gradually separating their target from the collaborative relationships that provide both support and protection. The isolation process is always gradual and seemingly benevolent. It begins with flattery. You're told you're too talented for your current situation, too sophisticated for your current friends, too valuable to be wasted on routine group activities. The manipulator positions themselves as your champion, the one person who recognizes your true worth, and wants to help you achieve the recognition you deserve. But isolation serves a crucial strategic purpose for betrayers. When you're connected to others, you have witnesses to conversations, allies who can verify your version of events, and supporters who will defend you when attacks come. When you're isolated, it becomes your word against theirs, and they've had time to prepare their narrative while you've been cut off from the people who could corroborate your truth. I've observed that healthy relationships encourage broader connections. People who genuinely care about you want you to have strong friendships, professional networks, and family bonds because they understand that these relationships make you stronger and happier. They don't feel threatened by your other connections, they celebrate them. Dangerous people, however, see your other relationships as obstacles to their control. They'll find reasons why your friends don't understand you, why your colleagues are jealous of you, why your family doesn't appreciate you. They'll create urgency around spending time with them instead of others, making you feel guilty for maintaining outside relationships. The antidote to isolation tactics is maintaining your connections despite pressure to abandon them. When someone consistently discourages your other relationships or creates conflict between you and people you trust, that person has revealed their true intentions. They don't want you to be happy and supported. They want you to be dependent and controllable. During my years studying the rise and fall of Fra Girolamo Savonarola in Florence, I witnessed one of history's most effective campaigns of systematic isolation. The Dominican friar didn't simply preach against vice. He methodically separated his followers from any source of information or influence that might challenge his authority. Savonarola understood that controlling information is the key to controlling people. He convinced his followers that secular books were corrupting their souls, leading to the infamous bonfire of the vanities where citizens burned their own libraries. He argued that friendships with non-believers would weaken their faith, gradually isolating the faithful from family members and former companions who might question his increasingly extreme demands. What fascinated me was how willingly people participated in their own isolation. Savonarola didn't force them to burn their books. He convinced them it was their idea. He didn't forbid outside friendships. He made his followers feel guilty and spiritually compromised for maintaining them. This is the genius of psychological manipulation. The victims become complicit in their own control. The isolation process creates what I call artificial dependency. When people lose access to alternative perspectives, they become entirely reliant on their manipulator for information, validation, and guidance. The manipulator becomes their only window to the outside world, and naturally, that window shows only what serves the manipulator's purposes. I observed this pattern repeatedly in various courts and organizations. The process always follows similar stages. First, the manipulator identifies people who are already somewhat isolated or vulnerable, those new to an organization, going through personal difficulties, or feeling undervalued. These individuals are hungry for connection and validation, making them ideal targets. Next comes the love bombing phase, where the manipulator provides intense positive attention, making their target feel special and chosen. During this phase, they gather information about the target's other relationships, identifying which connections represent potential threats to their influence. Then begins the subtle undermining of those connections. The manipulator doesn't attack the target's other relationships directly. Instead, they plant seeds of doubt. They might mention that a colleague seemed dismissive of the target's ideas in a meeting, or suggest that a friend's advice sounds jealous or unsupportive. They reinterpret innocent actions as signs of betrayal or disrespect. Simultaneously, they create artificial urgency around their own relationship with the target. They schedule important conversations during times when the target would normally be with others. They create emergencies that require immediate attention, making the target feel guilty for prioritizing other relationships. They establish exclusive communication channels, private meetings, special projects, confidential information that make the target feel obligated to maintain secrecy from others. The final stage is creating new dependencies that make isolation feel necessary. They provide resources, opportunities, or emotional support that becomes essential to the target's well-being, then gradually make these benefits conditional on maintaining separation from others. The target begins to police their own isolation, believing it's necessary to preserve these crucial benefits. What makes this process so effective is that it exploits legitimate human needs. We all want to feel special, valued, and understood. We all need resources and opportunities to succeed. We all benefit from guidance and support during difficult times. Manipulators take these healthy needs and weaponize them, creating artificial scarcity and exclusive access that makes their victims desperate to maintain their favor. The tragedy is that genuine relationships actually multiply support rather than hoarding it. Real friends introduce you to other friends. Good mentors connect you with other mentors. Healthy organizations encourage networking and collaboration. When someone's support comes with the requirement that you isolate yourself from others, that support is not love, it's control. The second unmistakable sign of a dangerous person is their compulsive need to test your boundaries. I learned this through observing Pope Alexander VI, whose systematic violation of every moral, political, and personal boundary ultimately corrupted everyone around him. What began as small transgressions, inappropriate jokes, minor protocol violations, requests for small favors, gradually escalated into the complete moral destruction of the papal court. Boundary testing serves a crucial purpose for manipulators. It identifies how much violation you'll accept before resisting. Every small transgression that goes unchallenged becomes permission for a larger one. It's like a thief testing doors. In a neighborhood, they're not looking for the strongest security. They're looking for the easiest entry point. I watched this pattern play out countless times in Renaissance courts. A courtier would begin with minor violations, arriving late to meetings, interrupting conversations, making slightly inappropriate comments. If these behaviors were tolerated or excused, they would escalate, taking credit for others' ideas, sharing confidential information, making increasingly personal demands. The genius of this approach is that each violation builds on the previous one. By the time the target realizes they're being systematically exploited, they've already established a pattern of accepting unacceptable behavior. The manipulator can point to this history and claim, with apparent justification, that the target has always been fine with such treatment. In my experience, people who respect you never need to test your boundaries. They naturally stay within appropriate limits, because they value your comfort and dignity. When someone consistently pushes against your stated preferences, requests exceptions to reasonable rules, or seems compelled to see how much they can get away with, they're revealing their fundamental lack of respect for you as a person. The testing often begins with time boundaries. They'll arrive late for appointments, expecting you to wait. They'll extend meetings beyond agreed limits, assuming you'll accommodate them. They'll contact you at inappropriate hours, testing whether you'll prioritize their convenience over your own needs. Each accepted violation teaches them that your time is less valuable than theirs. Next comes testing of professional or personal boundaries. They'll ask for favors that exceed normal relationship parameters, borrowing money, sharing confidential information, using your resources for their benefit. They'll position these requests as emergencies or special circumstances, but the pattern reveals their true intention, establishing that normal rules don't apply to them. Emotional boundary testing is perhaps the most insidious form. They'll make comments that are slightly too personal, share information that makes you uncomfortable, or push conversations into territory you've indicated you prefer to avoid. They'll test your reactions to inappropriate humor, controversial opinions, or disrespectful treatment of others, gauging whether you'll remain silent or speak up. What I find particularly revealing is how boundary testers respond when challenged. Healthy people apologize when they realize they've overstepped. They hadn't intended to make you uncomfortable, and they appreciate the clarification. Dangerous people become defensive, argumentative, or manipulative when confronted about their behavior. They'll minimize the violation. "I was just joking," or "you're being too sensitive." They'll deflect responsibility. "That's not what I meant," or you misunderstood my intentions. They'll even reverse the blame. I can't believe you would think that about me, making you feel guilty for noticing their inappropriate behavior. The most dangerous response is when they temporarily back off, only to resume testing from a different angle. This demonstrates that the boundary violation was intentional and strategic, not accidental. They're simply looking for your weak points, the areas where you're least likely to resist their encroachment. I've observed that in healthy relationships, boundaries become clearer and more respected over time. People learn what you're comfortable with and naturally adjust their behavior to honor those preferences. In relationships with dangerous people, boundaries become battlegrounds where every limit you set becomes a challenge they feel compelled to overcome. The key to protecting yourself is maintaining your boundaries consistently, regardless of the excuses, emergencies, or special circumstances they present. Every exception you make teaches them that your boundaries are negotiable. Unnegotiable boundaries are no boundaries at all. The escalation pattern of boundary violations follows a predictable sequence that I first documented while studying the condottieri, the mercenary captains who sold their services to Italian city-states. These men were masters of gradually normalizing increasingly outrageous behavior until their employers found themselves accepting treatment they would have rejected outright at the beginning of the relationship. The process begins with what I call innocent violations, behaviors that could reasonably be attributed to misunderstanding, cultural differences, or temporary circumstances. A condottiero might arrive slightly late for a strategic meeting, claiming his horse had thrown a shoe. He might question a direct order, suggesting he knows the terrain better than the maps indicate. These initial violations are small enough to excuse but significant enough to test the employer's response. If these minor transgressions are overlooked or rationalized away, the violations increase in both frequency and severity. The late arrivals become a pattern rather than an exception. The questioning of orders evolves into outright insubordination. What began as collaborative discussion transforms into demands for special treatment and exceptions to standard protocol. The psychological brilliance of this approach lies in how it exploits human adaptation. We naturally adjust to gradual changes in our environment, often without noticing how dramatically our circumstances have shifted. A frog placed in boiling water will jump out immediately, but a frog in cool water that's gradually heated will remain until it dies. Boundary violators understand this principle and use it systematically. Each violation creates a new baseline for acceptable behavior. What shocked you last month becomes unremarkable this month. The manipulator establishes precedent by pointing to previous instances where you accepted similar treatment. You didn't mind when I borrowed your horse before, or last time you said it was fine if I changed the battle plans. The escalation also serves to condition your responses. Early in the relationship, you might have objected strongly to inappropriate behavior, but after months of small violations, your resistance weakens. You become trained to accept progressively worse treatment because speaking up has become exhausting and seemingly pointless. I observed this pattern most clearly in the relationship between Cesare Borgia and his various allies. He would begin new alliances with perfect protocol and respectful behavior. Gradually, he would introduce small violations, reading their correspondence, questioning their loyalty, demanding access to their resources. By the time he was openly threatening their families and seizing their territories, his victims had been conditioned to accept each escalation as merely the next logical step in their relationship. The most insidious aspect of this process is how it makes victims complicit in their own exploitation. Because they accepted smaller violations, they feel they have no moral standing to object to larger ones. They become trapped by their own precedent, unable to draw lines they should have drawn months earlier. Boundary violators also use intermittent reinforcement to maintain their victims' compliance. Between violations, They provide positive attention, apologies, or rewards that make their targets grateful and hopeful for improvement. This creates a psychological addiction to the relationship, where victims endure increasing abuse in hopes of returning to those brief moments of positive treatment. The pattern always culminates in what I call the ultimate violation, the betrayal that the manipulator has been building toward from the beginning. By this point, their victim is so isolated, so conditioned to accept mistreatment, and so dependent on the relationship that they're unable to effectively resist or escape. Understanding this escalation pattern is crucial for protection because it reveals that early resistance is far more effective than later confrontation. The time to draw lines is when violations are small and the relationship is new, not after months or years of gradually deteriorating treatment. A person who cannot respect your smallest boundaries will never respect your largest ones. The antidote is simple but requires courage. Respond to the first violation as seriously as you would respond to the last one. Maintain your standards consistently, regardless of excuses or explanations. Remember that someone who truly respects you will welcome clear boundaries rather than constantly testing them. The third betrayal sign is perhaps the most seductive and therefore the most dangerous. When someone regularly shares other people's secrets with you. I learned this lesson through Cardinal Giovanni della Rovere, who built his influence in the Vatican through a sophisticated network of confession and gossip that ultimately ensnared everyone who trusted him, including myself. Della Rovere possessed an uncanny ability to make people feel special by sharing confidential information about others. He would lean in conspiratorially during dinner parties and whisper scandalous details about fellow cardinals, who was sleeping with whom, who was embezzling church funds, who was plotting against the Pope. These revelations created an intoxicating sense of being on the inside, of having access to the hidden truths that shaped the world around us. What I didn't initially understand was that Della Rovere's gossip served multiple strategic purposes beyond simple social bonding. First, it created artificial intimacy between us. When someone shares secrets with you, it feels like a gesture of special trust, as though you've been elevated to their inner circle. This false intimacy made me more likely to share my own confidential information in return, believing we had established a relationship of mutual trust. Second, the secrets he shared served as warnings disguised as gossip. When he told me about Cardinal Rierio's financial problems, he was subtly communicating that he had access to everyone's private information and the power to destroy reputations with a whisper. When he described other cardinals' political mistakes, he was showing me exactly what would happen if I crossed him or failed to maintain his favor. Third, and most cunningly, sharing secrets created a sense of complicity. Once I had listened to confidential information about others, I became invested in maintaining the relationship that provided access to such valuable intelligence. I also became vulnerable to accusations of participating in gossip networks myself. If our relationship soured, Della Rovere could claim I had encouraged his indiscretions or even initiated them. The psychology of secret sharing is devastatingly effective because it exploits fundamental human curiosities and insecurities. We all want to understand the hidden dynamics around us, to know who we can trust and who poses threats. When someone offers to pull back the curtain and show us what's really happening, it feels like a gift rather than manipulation. But here's what I eventually realized. People who gossip to you will gossip about you. The cardinal who entertained me with stories of others' sins was simultaneously entertaining others with stories of mine. The same mouth that whispered confidential information about my colleagues was whispering confidential information about me to different audiences. The pattern always follows the same structure. They share secrets about person A with you, secrets about person B with you, and secrets about you with persons A and B. This creates a triangle of mutual suspicion and dependency, where everyone knows sensitive information about everyone else, and the secret sharer sits at the center, controlling the flow of information and therefore controlling the relationships. In modern contexts, I see this pattern constantly repeated. The colleague who shares confidential information about other team members' salaries, personal problems, or performance issues is gathering similar information about you to share with others. The friend who loves to discuss mutual acquaintances, relationship problems, financial struggles, or family secrets is undoubtedly discussing your personal information with those same acquaintances. Secret sharing also serves as a recruitment tool for manipulators. They identify people's vulnerabilities by observing what kinds of information they're most interested in hearing. Someone who eagerly listens to workplace gossip can be controlled through fear of becoming the subject of such gossip. Someone who enjoys hearing about others' romantic troubles can be manipulated through threats to their own reputation or relationships. The most dangerous aspect of this behavior is how it normalizes confidentiality violations. When you regularly hear other people's private information, you gradually become desensitized to the importance of discretion. Your own standards for what should remain confidential begin to erode, making you more likely to share information you should protect. I've observed that trustworthy people handle confidential information very differently. They avoid sharing others' personal details, even when they have access to such information. They redirect conversations away from gossip rather than contributing to it. When they do need to discuss sensitive matters for legitimate reasons, they're careful about context, audience, and purpose. When someone consistently brings you other people's secrets, they're showing you exactly how they handle confidential information carelessly, strategically, and without respect for the people who trusted them. This is not intimacy, it's reconnaissance. They're not sharing secrets because they trust you. They're sharing secrets because they want to own you. The tragic fate of Katerina Sforza, the fierce Countess of Forluck, taught me the ultimate lesson about how shared confidences become weapons in the hands of betrayers. Katerina was known throughout Italy for her intelligence, courage, and political acumen. Yet she was ultimately destroyed not by superior military force but by the systematic weaponization of her own private communications. Her downfall began with her trusted secretary, Antonio degli Ordelaffi, a man who had served her family faithfully for years. Ordelaffi had access to all her correspondence, letters to allies, strategic plans, personal communications with her children, even her most intimate thoughts about marriage prospects and financial concerns. This access was necessary for his duties, and Katerina trusted him completely. What she didn't realize was that Ordelaffi had been carefully copying every significant piece of correspondence and building a comprehensive intelligence file that he eventually sold to her enemies. More devastatingly, he had been sharing selected excerpts with other members of her court, creating a web of compromised individuals who all possessed fragments of information that could destroy each other. The brilliance of his strategy lay in how he distributed this information. He never gave anyone the complete picture. Instead, he shared just enough with each person to make them feel privileged and informed, while simultaneously making them complicit in his espionage network. A general might receive copies of letters questioning his loyalty. A diplomat might see correspondence criticizing his negotiation skills. A financial advisor might read comments about his competence. Each recipient faced the same dilemma. They now possessed information that could harm their colleagues, but using it would reveal their own participation in Ordelaffi's intelligence network. They became trapped in a system where everyone knew damaging information about everyone else, but no one could act on it without exposing themselves. This is the true genius of information warfare, as practiced by master manipulators. They don't simply collect secrets, they distribute them strategically to create networks of mutual assured destruction. Everyone becomes both blackmailer and victim, controller and controlled, secret keeper and secret seller. The psychological impact of this system extends far beyond the immediate damage of exposed secrets. When people know their private communications are being shared, they begin to self-censor, to doubt their own judgment, to question every relationship. The knowledge that confidences are being violated creates an atmosphere of paranoia and mistrust that ultimately destroys the organization from within. I watched this pattern destroy numerous institutions throughout my career, in the Florentine government, in the papal court, in various military organizations. Wherever information became currency, the same destructive dynamics emerged. People stopped communicating honestly, alliances became superficial and temporary, and genuine collaboration became impossible. The most insidious aspect of this system is how it corrupts even innocent participants. When you know that everyone else is trading in secrets, you feel pressure to gather your own intelligence for protection. When you see others advancing through gossip and intrigue, you begin to question whether honesty and discretion are simply naive handicaps in a world where information equals power. But I also observed the antidote to this poison. Leaders who absolutely refused to participate in gossip networks, who maintained strict confidentiality even when it seemed disadvantageous, who consistently redirected conversations away from inappropriate information sharing, created different organizational cultures entirely. Their teams developed higher trust, better communication, and more genuine loyalty because people knew their confidences would be protected. The key insight is that information warfare requires participants to function. When someone tries to share inappropriate secrets with you, your response determines whether you become part of their network or remain outside it. Politely declining to hear gossip, refusing to share confidential information, and maintaining consistent discretion in your own communications creates a protective barrier that manipulators cannot penetrate. Caterina Sforza's correspondence was ultimately used to coordinate the military campaign that destroyed her power and sent her into exile. Her own words, twisted and taken out of context, became the weapons that her enemies used against her. This tragedy could have been prevented if she had recognized that anyone who traffics in others' secrets will inevitably traffic in yours. The fourth and perhaps most revealing sign of a dangerous person is their absolute inability to take responsibility for their failures, mistakes, or harmful actions. I learned this through my extensive observations of Girolamo Riario, Count of Forche, a man whose refusal to acknowledge his own errors ultimately led to his assassination and the destruction of everything he claimed to value. Riario kept detailed records of every setback, failure, and disappointment in his political and military career, but not one entry in his extensive journals ever attributed any problem to his own decisions or actions. Military defeats were blamed on incompetent generals, subordinate officers, or inadequate supplies. Diplomatic failures were attributed to treacherous allies, impossible circumstances, or the unreasonable demands of other parties. Financial problems stemmed from dishonest advisors, unexpected expenses, or the ingratitude of those he had helped. What made this pattern so dangerous was not simply the abdication of personal responsibility, but how it revealed his fundamental relationship with truth and accountability. A person who cannot acknowledge their own mistakes, cannot learn from them, cannot improve their decision-making, and cannot build the self-awareness necessary for genuine leadership or trustworthy relationships. More insidiously, Riario's blame-shifting served a strategic purpose. It identified scapegoats for future betrayals. Every person he blamed for past failures became a potential target for elimination when he needed to deflect responsibility for new problems. His journals weren't just records of grievances, they were hit lists in formation. I observed this pattern consistently throughout my career in diplomacy and politics. People who cannot take responsibility for small errors will never take responsibility for large betrayals. If they can't admit to making a poor strategic decision, they certainly won't admit to deliberately sabotaging a colleague. If they can't acknowledge their role in a failed negotiation, they won't hesitate to blame you when their larger schemes collapse. The psychology of responsibility avoidance reveals profound character flaws that extend far beyond simple ego protection. It demonstrates a fundamental disconnection from reality, an inability to engage honestly with cause and effect, and a willingness to sacrifice others to maintain their self-image. When you observe someone consistently deflecting blame, you're witnessing several dangerous traits in action. First, you're seeing someone who values their reputation more than truth, their comfort more than justice, and their image more than the welfare of people around them. Second, you're observing someone who has never developed the emotional maturity necessary for genuine relationships or ethical behavior. Most revealing is how responsibility avoiders handle situations where their failures have harmed others. A trustworthy person who makes a mistake that damages someone else feels genuine remorse, takes immediate action to minimize the harm, and implements changes to prevent similar problems in the future. Dangerous people, however, focus entirely on protecting themselves from consequences rather than addressing the damage they've caused. They minimize the harm. It wasn't that serious, or you're overreacting to a minor issue. They shift focus to the victim's response rather than their own actions. I can't believe you're making such a big deal about this, or your anger is really the problem here. Most dangerous of all, they rewrite history to cast themselves as the victim. Suddenly, their harmful actions become defensive responses to your unreasonable behavior. Their betrayals become justified reactions to your alleged provocations. They transform themselves from perpetrator to victim so convincingly that observers and, sometimes even their actual victims, begin to question who was really at fault. I watched this exact pattern destroy Riario's relationship with every ally, advisor, and family member. Each person who tried to hold him accountable for his mistakes became, in his narrative, another enemy who had betrayed him. By the end of his life, he was surrounded only by sycophants who told him what he wanted to hear, because anyone with integrity had been driven away. By his refusal to acknowledge reality, the connection between responsibility, avoidance, and betrayal is absolute because both stem from the same character defect, the belief that others exist to serve their needs and absorb the costs of their failures. Someone who cannot acknowledge their mistakes views other people as expendable resources rather than human beings deserving of respect and honesty. When you encounter someone who consistently avoids responsibility, you're dealing with a person who has already demonstrated their willingness to sacrifice your welfare for their comfort. They have shown you that maintaining their self-image matters more to them than justice, truth, or your well-being. This is not a character flaw that improves with time or patience. It's a fundamental orientation toward the world that makes betrayal inevitable. The most reliable predictor of future betrayal is past responsibility avoidance, because the same psychological mechanisms that prevent someone from acknowledging small mistakes will prevent them from acknowledging large betrayals. In fact, the more severe their actions become, the more desperately they'll need scapegoats to maintain that self-image as the perpetual victim of others' incompetence and malice. The contrast between dangerous and trustworthy leaders becomes starkest when examining how they handle failure and accountability. I observed this difference most clearly by comparing Francesco Sforza, Duke of Milan, with his contemporary rivals. Sforza's military dispatches and leadership style revealed a man who understood that true strength comes from honest self-assessment, while his enemies demonstrated how Responsibility avoidance breeds weakness and eventual destruction. Francesco Sforza possessed a rare quality among Renaissance leaders. He consistently took responsibility for his failures while sharing credit for his successes. After losing the Battle of Caravaggio, he wrote detailed analyses of his strategic errors, acknowledged his misjudgment of enemy capabilities, and implemented specific changes to prevent similar mistakes. His dispatches never blamed his soldiers, his advisors, or circumstances beyond his control. They focused entirely on what he could have done differently. This approach created extraordinary loyalty among his followers because they knew their leader would never sacrifice them to protect his own reputation. Soldiers fought harder for a general who acknowledged his own mistakes than for one who blamed them for every setback. Advisors provided more honest counsel to a leader who welcomed criticism than to one who punished uncomfortable truths. Contrast this with leaders like Vitellozzo Vitelli, whose military career was marked by consistent blame-shifting and responsibility avoidance. After every defeat, Vitelli found reasons why the failure belonged to others: inadequate intelligence, cowardly soldiers, treacherous allies, impossible terrain. His dispatches read like legal briefs, defending his decisions rather than military analyses aimed at improvement. This pattern created a downward spiral that I witnessed repeatedly throughout my career. Because Vitelli couldn't acknowledge his own errors, he couldn't learn from them. Because he couldn't learn from them, he repeated the same mistakes continuously. Because his mistakes had no consequences for him personally, he had no incentive to develop better judgment or decision-making skills. More dangerously, his responsibility avoidance corrupted everyone around him. Subordinates learned to provide information that protected them from blame, rather than information that served strategic purposes. They focused on creating documented evidence of their own competence, rather than collaborating effectively toward shared goals. The entire organization became oriented toward avoiding accountability rather than achieving excellence. The responsibility paradox reveals that leaders who accept accountability actually have more control over their outcomes than those who avoid it. When you acknowledge your role in failures, you maintain agency to prevent similar problems in the future. When you blame external factors exclusively, you render yourself powerless to improve your situation. I noticed that trustworthy leaders often took responsibility for problems that weren't entirely their fault, while dangerous leaders avoided responsibility even for problems they had directly caused. Sforza would apologize for strategic decisions that seemed reasonable at the time, but produced poor outcomes. Vitelli would deny culpability for obvious tactical errors that directly led to military disasters. This difference in approach reflected fundamentally different relationships with power and authority. Sforza understood that leadership meant accepting responsibility for outcomes, whether or not you could control all the variables that influenced them. Vitelli believed that leadership meant maintaining a perfect record through the strategic management of blame and credit. The long-term consequences of these approaches were predictable and inevitable. Sforza built an empire that outlasted his death because he created systems and relationships based on trust and accountability. Vitelli destroyed every alliance and opportunity through his pattern of betrayal and blame-shifting, ultimately dying alone and UNMO. In modern contexts, I see the same patterns playing out in corporations, political organizations, and personal relationships. Leaders who consistently acknowledge their contributions to problems build stronger teams and achieve better outcomes than those who focus on protecting their reputations. The paradox is that accepting responsibility actually enhances your authority, while avoiding it undermines your credibility and effectiveness. The most dangerous people I've encountered always revealed themselves through their response to failure and criticism. They couldn't tolerate having their judgment questioned, their decisions challenged, or their mistakes acknowledged. This intolerance for accountability inevitably led to increasingly desperate attempts to control information and eliminate anyone who threatened their carefully constructed self-image. The Pazzi conspiracy of 1478 provides the perfect case study for understanding how all four betrayal signs operate together in a coordinated campaign of deception. When I analyze this plot with the wisdom of hindsight and the framework I've developed, the warning signs appear so obvious that it seems impossible anyone could have missed them, yet they did, nearly costing Lorenzo de' Medici his life. The isolation campaign began months before the actual assassination attempt. Francesco Pazzi and his co-conspirators systematically worked to separate Lorenzo from his most trusted protectors and advisors. They arranged elaborate social events that required Lorenzo to attend without his usual security detail, claiming that armed guards would be insulting to fellow Florentine nobles. They scheduled important business meetings during times when his closest allies were traveling or otherwise occupied. Most insidiously, they convinced Lorenzo that his growing reputation was making some of his traditional supporters jealous and resentful. They planted suggestions that certain longtime allies were speaking critically of his policies in private gatherings. This created artificial distance between Lorenzo and people who might have warned him about the conspiracy, while simultaneously making him more dependent on the conspirators themselves for accurate information about political sentiment. The boundary testing was equally systematic and revealing. The conspirators began making increasingly bold requests for access to sensitive information about Medici business operations, military capabilities, and political strategies. When Lorenzo hesitated to share certain details, they expressed hurt feelings about his apparent lack of trust in their friendship and loyalty. They tested his personal boundaries by requesting private meetings in unusual locations, asking for exceptions to normal protocols, and gradually establishing patterns of behavior that violated standard security procedures. Each successful test made the next violation seem normal and reasonable. By the time they were requesting access to the cathedral for their special religious observance, Lorenzo had been conditioned to accommodate their unusual requests. The information warfare was perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of their campaign. The conspirators regularly shared confidential details about other prominent Florentine families, their financial problems, political disagreements, personal scandals. This created the impression that they were Lorenzo's closest confidants, privy to all the city's secrets and devoted to his interests above all others. But the information they shared served multiple purposes beyond creating false intimacy. It demonstrated their extensive intelligence network, while simultaneously showing Lorenzo exactly what would happen to his own secrets if he fell from their favor. They were essentially threatening him through the example of how they discussed others, while making the threat seem like friendly gossip. Most tellingly, they used their access to gather intelligence about Lorenzo's routines, relationships, and vulnerabilities. Every secret they learned about his schedule, his security arrangements, or his personal concerns became part of their assassination planning. The false intimacy they created through gossip was actually a reconnaissance operation disguised as friendship. The responsibility avoidance became apparent only in retrospect. But the pattern was consistent throughout the lead-up to the conspiracy. Whenever their previous schemes against Medici interests had failed, the conspirators had blamed external circumstances, inadequate support from allies, or Lorenzo's own unreasonable responses to their legitimate concerns. They never acknowledged that their goals might be inappropriate or their methods questionable. This pattern should have warned Lorenzo that these were people who would never accept accountability for their actions. When someone consistently blames others for their failures, they've already demonstrated their willingness to sacrifice anyone to protect themselves. The same psychological mechanism that prevented them from acknowledging their past mistakes would prevent them from accepting responsibility for their planned betrayal. What makes this case study so instructive is how the four signs reinforced each other to create the perfect conditions for betrayal. The isolation made Lorenzo more vulnerable to manipulation. The boundary testing conditioned him to accept inappropriate behavior. The information warfare created false intimacy while gathering intelligence. The responsibility avoidance revealed their fundamental lack of integrity. Working together, these four patterns created a situation where Lorenzo trusted his enemies more than his friends, where abnormal behavior seemed normal, where his own secrets were being used against him, and where people with no moral constraints had convinced him they were devoted to his welfare. The conspiracy nearly succeeded because it exploited every psychological vulnerability that these patterns create. After decades of navigating treacherous political waters and observing countless betrayals, I developed a personal protection system that kept me alive and influential while many of my contemporaries were destroyed by the very people they trusted most. These strategies aren't based on paranoia or cynicism. They're practical applications of the patterns I observed in human behavior. My first principle was maintaining what I called strategic diversity in my relationships and information sources. I never allowed myself to become dependent on any single person for critical resources, information, or opportunities. When someone tried to isolate me by suggesting that others couldn't be trusted or didn't understand my true worth, I intensified my efforts to maintain those relationships rather than abandoning them. I established a rule that any attempt to separate me from my existing network was automatically suspicious, regardless of how reasonable the justification seemed. Whether someone claimed my colleagues were jealous, my friends were using me, or my family didn't appreciate my talents, I treated these suggestions as red flags rather than insights. Genuine supporters want you to have strong relationships because they understand that isolation makes you vulnerable. For boundary protection, I developed clear, consistent policies that I applied regardless of circumstances or relationships. I never made exceptions to these policies for emergencies, special situations, or people who claimed to deserve different treatment. This approach eliminated the boundary testing that manipulators use to condition their victims for larger violations. My policies covered everything from information sharing to meeting locations to financial arrangements. I shared confidential information only with people who had demonstrated long-term trustworthiness, and only when such sharing served legitimate purposes. I met with potentially dangerous people only in locations where I controlled the environment and had witnesses. I never lent money or resources to anyone who couldn't afford to lose my friendship. Along with my investment, the key was consistency. When someone tested my boundaries, my response was always the same, regardless of their status, our relationship, or their emotional reaction to my policies. This predictability protected me because manipulators look for flexibility they can exploit, need to find situations where your normal rules don't apply. Information warfare required the most sophisticated countermeasures. I developed a strict policy against participating in gossip networks, regardless of how valuable the information seemed or how trustworthy the source appeared. When someone tried to share inappropriate secrets about others, I politely but firmly declined to hear them. When someone asked for confidential information about third parties, I refused regardless of their justification. This approach had several protective effects. First, it kept me out of triangulated relationships where multiple parties had compromising information about each other. Second, it established my reputation for discretion, which actually increased the quality of information people shared with me because they trusted me to keep their confidences. Third, it denied potential manipulators the ammunition they needed to control or blackmail me. I also developed what I called verification protocols for any significant information I received. Rather than acting on rumors, gossip, or even seemingly reliable reports, I established independent sources to confirm important details before making decisions. This protected me from manipulation through false information while also revealing when someone was deliberately spreading misinformation. For dealing with responsibility avoiders, I maintained detailed records of conversations, agreements, and outcomes when someone consistently blamed others for problems or refused to acknowledge their mistakes. I documented these patterns carefully. This documentation served multiple purposes. It helped me recognize dangerous people more quickly. It provided evidence when others questioned my assessment of someone's character. And it protected me from gaslighting attempts when manipulators tried to rewrite history. Perhaps most importantly, I learned to trust my instincts about people while verifying my impressions through careful observation. When someone made me feel uncomfortable, isolated, or confused about my own perceptions, I treated these feelings as valuable information rather than personal weaknesses. Manipulators are skilled at making their victims doubt their own judgment. So maintaining confidence in your ability to assess character becomes crucial for protection. My system wasn't perfect, and it didn't prevent every betrayal or manipulation attempt, but it significantly reduced my vulnerability while allowing me to maintain the relationships and opportunities necessary for political effectiveness. The goal wasn't to eliminate all risk that would have required complete isolation. The goal was to minimize risk while maximizing the ability to recognize and respond to dangerous patterns before they could cause serious harm. The fundamental patterns of human betrayal remain unchanged from my era to yours, but the methods and contexts have evolved in ways that make recognition both more crucial and more challenging. Modern technology and social structures have given manipulators new tools while preserving the same psychological vulnerabilities that make their tactics effective in today's workplace. Isolation tactics have become more sophisticated and harder to detect. A manipulative colleague might use digital communication to gradually separate you from team dynamics, scheduling important video calls during your known availability conflicts, creating private chat channels that exclude certain team members, or sharing sensitive information through direct messages that make you feel special while cutting you off from broader conversations. Social media provides unprecedented opportunities for boundary testing disguised as friendship or professional networking. Someone might start by requesting connection on professional platforms, then gradually migrate to more personal channels. They test your comfort with sharing personal information, your willingness to engage with controversial content, or your response to increasingly inappropriate private messages. The digital age has also revolutionized information warfare. Modern manipulators can share screenshots of private conversations, forward confidential emails, or create group chats specifically designed to spread gossip and create triangulated relationships. They use social media to gather intelligence about your personal life, family, relationships, and social connections that can later be weaponized against you. Perhaps most insidiously, technology enables responsibility avoidance on a scale I could never have imagined in Renaissance Italy. Digital communication allows people to misrepresent conversations through selective editing, claim technical problems caused their failures to respond to critical messages, or blame automated systems for errors they created intentionally. Corporate structures provide new contexts for these ancient patterns. A dangerous manager might isolate high-performing employees by assigning them to special projects that remove them from team interactions, while positioning this isolation as recognition of their superior abilities. They test boundaries by gradually increasing workload expectations, requesting access to personal time, or asking for flexibility on policies that should apply equally to everyone in personal relationships. Modern manipulators exploit the complexity of contemporary social networks. They might discourage their romantic partners from maintaining friendships by suggesting that those friends are bad influences. jealous of the relationship, or simply taking up time that should be devoted to the partnership. They create artificial urgency around spending time together while making their partners feel guilty about maintaining other relationships. Dating apps and social media provide endless opportunities for boundary testing in romantic contexts. Someone might start with small violations, showing up late for dates, changing plans at the last minute, or pressuring for physical intimacy faster than you're comfortable with. Each accepted violation conditions you to accept progressively worse treatment. The responsibility avoidance I observed in Renaissance courts has found perfect expression in modern corporate and political environments. Leaders blame market conditions, regulatory changes, or global circumstances for problems they created through poor decision-making. They use consultant reports, focus group data, or anonymous feedback to justify unpopular decisions, while avoiding personal accountability for those choices. Social media enables responsibility avoidance on a personal level that would have been impossible in my era. People can delete posts that reflect poorly on them, claim they were hacked when caught in lies, or hide behind the anonymity of online interactions to avoid consequences for their harmful behavior. What makes modern betrayal particularly dangerous is how it exploits the pace and complexity of contemporary life. People are overwhelmed with information, responsibilities, and social connections, making it harder to pay attention to the subtle patterns that reveal dangerous character. The same technologies that could help us document and recognize these patterns often distract us from the careful observation that protection requires. However, the same fundamental principles I developed in Renaissance Italy remain effective for modern protection. Maintaining diverse relationships, establishing clear boundaries, refusing to participate in gossip networks, and holding people accountable for their actions work just as well against contemporary manipulators as they did against Cesare Borgia or the Pazzi conspirators. The key insight is that while the tools and contexts change, human nature remains constant. People who would have betrayed their allies in Renaissance Italian courts will betray their colleagues in modern corporate offices. The same character flaws that made someone dangerous in my era make them dangerous in yours. Technology has given these individuals new capabilities, but it hasn't changed the fundamental patterns that reveal their intentions. Building effective defenses against betrayal requires creating systems that protect you without isolating you from the relationships and opportunities essential for a fulfilling life. Like the fortress of San Leo, which protected its inhabitants while allowing them to engage with the world beyond its walls. Your personal defense system must balance security with accessibility. The foundation of any effective defense system is establishing clear personal policies before you need them. Decide in advance how you'll handle requests for confidential information, what boundaries you'll maintain in professional relationships, and what behaviors you'll accept from others. Having predetermined standards eliminates the emotional pressure and manipulation that often accompany boundary violations. Create specific policies for information sharing based on relationship duration and demonstrated trustworthiness. I recommend requiring at least 6 months of consistent, respectful behavior before sharing any sensitive, personal, or professional information. This waiting period allows you to observe whether someone respects boundaries, takes responsibility for their actions, and maintains appropriate discretion about others. Confidences. Establish documentation practices for important conversations and agreements, particularly with people you don't know well or who have exhibited concerning behavior. Keep records of promises made, commitments violated, and patterns of responsibility avoidance. This documentation protects you from gaslighting attempts and provides evidence when others question your assessment of someone's character. Build redundancy into your professional and personal networks. Never allow yourself to become dependent on a single person for crucial resources. information, or emotional support. When someone tries to become your exclusive source of opportunities or understanding, recognize this as a manipulation tactic rather than special devotion. Implement verification procedures for important information, especially when it comes from sources who engage in gossip or have shown other signs of unreliability. Before acting on rumors, complaints about others, or claims about opportunities, seek independent confirmation from trustworthy sources who have their own access to the relevant information. Create accountability systems that encourage honesty and discourage manipulation in your relationships. This means consistently acknowledging when you make mistakes, appreciating when others admit their errors, and maintaining consequences for people who consistently blame others for their problems. Most importantly, trust your emotional responses to people and situations. If someone makes you feel uncomfortable, confused about your own perceptions, or pressured to compromise your values, treat these feelings as valuable information rather than personal weaknesses. Manipulators are skilled at making their victims doubt their own judgment. So maintaining confidence in your ability to assess character becomes essential for protection. Establish clear consequences for boundary violations and apply them consistently, regardless of the violator's status or your relationship with them. The first violation of a clearly stated boundary should result in a direct conversation about your expectations. Repeated violations should result in reduced access to your time, information, or resources. Serious violations should result in ending the relationship entirely. Remember that implementing these defenses will reveal important information about the people in your life. Those who respect your boundaries will appreciate your clarity and adjust their behavior accordingly. Those who resist your protection measures, argue about your policies, or pressure you to make exceptions are revealing their intentions to exploit you. Your defense system should evolve based on your experiences and changing circumstances. But the core principles remain constant. Maintain diverse relationships, establish clear boundaries, document important interactions, verify significant information, and trust your instincts about people's character. These practices protect you while preserving your ability to form meaningful connections with trustworthy individuals. The Treaty of Lodi in 1454 demonstrated how genuine relationships based on mutual respect and accountability can create lasting peace and prosperity, even among former enemies. This diplomatic achievement taught me that the same principles protecting you from betrayal can guide you toward relationships that enhance rather than threaten your welfare. Strategic relationship building begins with recognizing that trustworthy people welcome your protective measures rather than resisting them. When I established clear boundaries with reliable allies, they appreciated the clarity and adjusted their behavior to respect my policies. When I implemented documentation practices, honest people saw this as professional prudence rather than personal insult. When I maintained diverse relationships, secure individuals encouraged these connections because they understood that isolation breeds vulnerability. Contrast this with how dangerous people respond to protection measures. They argue that boundaries demonstrate lack of trust, claim that documentation reveals paranoia, and insist that maintaining other relationships shows disloyalty to them. These reactions reveal their true intentions. They want access to exploit, not opportunities to contribute. The difference between healthy caution and destructive paranoia lies in your openness to trustworthy relationships alongside your protection from dangerous ones. Paranoia treats everyone as a threat and seeks complete isolation. Wisdom distinguishes between trustworthy and dangerous people, while remaining open to genuine connection with those who demonstrate integrity over time. Building trustworthy relationships requires applying the same criteria you use to identify dangerous people, but in reverse. Instead of watching for isolation tactics, Look for people who encourage your other relationships and connections. Instead of accepting boundary violations, appreciate those who respect your limits without being asked. Instead of tolerating gossips, value those who maintain discretion about others' confidences. Instead of excusing responsibility avoidance, partner with people who acknowledge their mistakes and work to improve. The most reliable indicator of trustworthiness is consistency between private and public behavior. People who treat you well only when others are watching, who speak differently about colleagues in their presence versus their absence, or who change their values based on their audience, are revealing their fundamental lack of integrity. Trustworthy people maintain consistent standards. Regardless of circumstances, time remains the most important factor in relationship assessment. Character reveals itself through patterns, not isolated incidents. Someone can fake integrity for days, weeks, or even months, but maintaining false character over years becomes increasingly difficult. This is why rushed intimacy, whether romantic, professional, or social, should always be viewed with suspicion. Create systems that encourage accountability and honesty in your relationships. This means acknowledging your own mistakes openly, appreciating when others admit their errors, and maintaining consequences for people who consistently blame others for their problems. Healthy relationships thrive under these conditions because both parties benefit from honest communication and mutual responsibility. The goal isn't to eliminate all risk from your relationships. That would require complete isolation and would deny you the benefits of genuine human connection. The goal is to identify and cultivate relationships with people whose character makes betrayal unlikely while protecting yourself from those whose patterns make betrayal inevitable. Mutual accountability creates stronger bonds than blind trust because it acknowledges human fallibility while establishing systems for addressing mistakes when they occur. When both parties know they'll be held responsible for their actions, they're more likely to act responsibly. When both parties know that errors will be addressed honestly rather than hidden or blamed on others, they're more likely to communicate openly about problems before they become serious. Strategic relationship building also means understanding that different relationships serve different purposes and require different levels of trust and access. Your closest confidants deserve more access to sensitive information than casual acquaintances. But even intimate relationships benefit from clear boundaries and mutual accountability. The wisdom of strategic relationships lies in recognizing that protection and connection aren't opposites. They're complementary forces that work together to create the security and support necessary for a fulfilling life. Good people want you to be protected because they want you to be safe and happy. They welcome your caution because they understand it protects both of you from manipulation and exploitation. As I near the end of my life and reflect on the countless betrayals I've witnessed and survived, I want to leave you with the most important truth I've learned. The cost of ignoring these warning signs is always higher than the cost of heeding them. Every person I knew who was destroyed by betrayal had received clear signals about their betrayer's character, but they chose to ignore those signals rather than accept the uncomfortable truth about someone they wanted to trust. The 4 signs. I've shared with you isolation tactics, boundary testing, inappropriate secret sharing, and responsibility avoidance are not subtle hints or uncertain indicators. They are clear, reliable patterns that predict betrayal with devastating accuracy. When you observe these behaviors in someone, you are not witnessing character flaws that might improve with time or patience. You are witnessing the systematic preparation for your destruction. My final advice is simple but crucial. Trust the patterns, not the explanations. When someone consistently violates boundaries, don't focus on their excuses, focus on their behavior. When someone tries to isolate you from others, don't be flattered by their claim that you're special. Recognize their attempt to make you vulnerable. When someone shares other secrets with you, don't feel privileged. Understand that your Secrets will soon be currency in their manipulation network. The modern world offers countless opportunities for connection, advancement, and fulfillment, but it also provides endless hunting grounds for those who would exploit your trust for their benefit. The same technologies that connect you to genuine allies also give manipulators unprecedented access to their victims. Your protection lies not in avoiding all risk, but in recognizing the difference between reasonable risks taken with trustworthy people and unnecessary vulnerabilities created by dangerous ones. Remember that protecting yourself protects others as well. When you refuse to enable manipulative behavior, you make it harder for dangerous people to harm their next victims. When you maintain clear boundaries and accountable relationships, you model healthy behavior for others who may be struggling to recognize these patterns in their own lives. The wisdom I've shared with you has been earned through centuries of human suffering caused by betrayal and manipulation. Every principle I've taught, every warning I've given, represents lessons learned through the destruction of people who failed to recognize these patterns in time. Honor their sacrifice by using this knowledge to protect yourself and others from the same fate. Your path forward requires vigilance, but not paranoia. It demands boundaries, but not isolation. It calls for careful assessment of character, but not cynical rejection of human connection. The goal is not to eliminate trust from your life, but to direct it toward people who have earned it through consistent demonstration of integrity over time. The legacy I hope to leave is not a world where people trust no one, but a world where people trust wisely, where the 4 signs of betrayal are recognized and heeded before they can cause harm, where manipulators find no victims, because everyone understands the patterns that reveal dangerous character. Take what I've taught you and use it to build a life surrounded by people whose character makes betrayal unthinkable. Use it to recognize and distance yourself from those whose patterns make betrayal inevitable. Most importantly, use it to become the kind of person others can trust completely, someone who builds up rather than isolates, who respects rather than violates boundaries, who maintains confidences rather than trading in secrets, and who takes responsibility rather than shifting blame. This is my final gift to you, the knowledge to distinguish between those who would destroy you and those who would defend you. Use it well, and may you never need to learn these lessons through the bitter experience of betrayal.